So I'm going to begin with a little bit of just sort of big picture numbers to kind of situate our conversation in something very tangible. So in the United States today, about 40 million people are living here and were not born here. And that is about 12.5% of the population. And that's kind of, we're nicely sort of getting back up to our immigration heyday after a long drought from the 1930s until about the 1970s. We were very starved for immigrants. And so, but that 12.5% is getting back up to about where we were in the boom decades of American immigration on either side of the turn of the 20th century, when immigrants made up 13 to 14% of the US population. So who is an immigrant? We wanted to kind of make sure that we were defining our terms. We're both practitioners. Sunita's much more of a practitioner than I am. And so in talking, when we say immigrant, which has a particular legal meaning, but we're going to use the word immigrant a little bit more loosely in this conversation to mean anyone who is here who wasn't born here. But we wanted to be more specific about what that means in legal terms. That includes people who are naturalized U.S. citizens, people who are green card holders, or what lawyers call LPRs, legal permanent residents, lawful permanent residents, people who are here on non-immigrant visas, student visas, work visas, and a whole host of other very small categories of things. People who came on a visa but then stayed past the expiration of that visa and are now here out of status. They have a legal situation that's a little bit different than people who arrived without ever having been processed at a point of entry in the first place. Immigration lawyers call people who entered without inspection iwis, not to be confused with kiwis. But the vulnerabilities that Sunita's going to talk about next really affect everyone in all of these categories except people who are naturalized U.S. citizens. And I think that that's really core to this conversation, that somebody who is a green card holder is as vulnerable legally as somebody who is undocumented. And so, kind of against that legal framework, the numbers shake out in some interesting ways. Of the roughly 40 million people in the U.S. today who are immigrants, 44% of them are naturalized U.S. citizens. 28% are undocumented, and then everybody else is somewhere in between, green card holders or one of the other visa categories that I described. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific situation of asylum seekers and asylees in the United States, in part because that's some of my expertise. Immigration equality represents people seeking asylum based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And so while I'm framing up the numbers, I think it's interesting to see just how tiny a slice of the pie refugees and asylum seekers are. A refugee and an asylum seeker are sort of twin definitions, and we're going to spend some time on kind of who is an asylum seeker, who is a refugee, and what is the definition when we break up into two groups later. But the State Department designates refugees as people who are outside of the United States and have a fear of persecution on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And that same definition applies to asylum seekers, but asylum seekers are people who are in the United States or at the border. And the number of people seeking asylum and winning asylum has dropped steadily over the past decade. So interestingly, right now, the numbers are quite small. Just over 20,000 people were granted asylum in the United States in 2009 and 2010. The number was essentially flat, just about a little bit more than 20,000. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people make up a little bit more than 0.5% of those asylum grants. And we'll come back to kind of some of the frame a little bit later. But
great. Okay. Thank you. So I was going to give everybody a little bit of a nutshell background of the deportation system. So lawyers call it the immigration removal system because there was a change in the law that kind of made some terminology changes, but we're all talking about deportation. So I think just to kind of, we could talk about this for the entire time. So just in a nutshell, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 really specific things that happened during the 1996 and 1997 Clinton immigration reforms. There was a series of 2, sometimes people think about it as more, really draconian reforms that impacted immigrants in really harsh ways. So the first way was that the laws expanded the categories of crimes for which non-citizens can be subject to mandatory deportation. That means that they'd be deported forever without the opportunity to ever come back. And they also don't have the opportunity for a judge to determine whether or not they should be given a second chance. These laws were also made retroactive, which means that for green card holders who maybe were convicted of, minor drug possession or some other kinds of offense that maybe wasn't considered a mandatory deportation offense at the time that they were sentenced, they would now be subject to mandatory deportation, even though they didn't know that at the time. Second, we have a scheme of mandatory detention, which means that while you're trying to fight to stay in the country, if you are one of those people who's eligible for some kind of a waiver or some form of relief or asylum, that you would be subject to mandatory detention. That means that, mandatory detention specifically for people with criminal offenses, not asylum seekers, but it means that even if you have minor offenses like turnstile jumping, multiple turnstile jumping or drug possession, then you have to stay in jail in a prison until your immigration court case and the appeals are adjudicated. Sometimes this takes many years. Third, starting in the late 90s, growing over the last 15 years, Congress has provided and authorized an incredible amount of money for immigration enforcement and detention. And just in terms of the numbers, before 1996, we were talking about around 6,000 people who were detained. But in 2011 and 2010, we were reaching upwards of almost 400,000 people. Sorry, I'm sort of confusing the numbers. It's 400,000 people who were deported a year. And so they say, what the agencies say is they say, well, this is how much money is appropriated, so that's why, that's the driving force, is this is what Congress is appropriating. But that sort of takes away the political impetus behind all of this. And I think it's important to note that the real, the numbers have gone even higher since the during the Obama administration. It was only about 300,000 at the peak of the Bush era, and so we've jumped incredibly during the Obama administration. And ICE's budget, it has grown, and prior to the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, which is the enforcement agency now, it was the Immigration Naturalization Service, and that budget in 2002 was $2.4 billion, and now it's doubled to $5.75 billion. Okay, so how do people find themselves in immigration or deportation proceedings? So there's a couple of common ways. The first is home or workplace raids. So this is where you have these black vans coming onto a work site or in a neighborhood and just knocking down doors and going and picking everybody up. The second is through airports or borders. And so whether that's the northern border or the southern border or airports, that's a huge place where people are picked up. And again, that's where a lot of people who are green card holders who didn't know that they were subject to their prior criminal offenses were subject to removal will then be detected and put into a detention facility.
Can I put even a finer point on that? I mean, that's a story of someone who might have been a long time, including clients that I've represented, long-time green card holders who leave the country often to visit an ill relative or for a family funeral and are coming back into the United States. Their entire family is here, and they are told as they show their green card to the officer at the airport, they're told that they're going to be detained, they are going to be put into immigration custody, they have no right to counsel, and that they are potentially deportable without seeing a lawyer. This is someone who could have lived in the United States legally for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and they're being removed because of something that may not have had any immigration consequences at the time that they committed the crime and were sentenced. I mean, I represented a guy who was in a fight with a guy who owed him money. The cops were called. He did like time served and for his one night in jail and was told by his defense attorney that this was like going to go away. This was nothing, which was true at the time. Mm-hmm. And he was losing his green card because of it 10 years later.
That's right. And I think it's also interesting that the way the laws work now, there are categories of people who are detected at the border who don't even have the right. They just get put through what's called expedited processing. They don't even go to see a judge. They don't even have the right to claim the right to stay here. They're just immediately processed and deported out of the country. And so, one of the things that I do a lot of work on is the way that the information is shared through different agencies. And so what we're seeing now is just this incredible linking of information between the Border Patrol Agency, between immigration, between the FBI, and all of that just makes it much more sophisticated and easy to detect people. But at the same time, it makes it easier for there to be errors in the information that's shared. Okay, and so then another way that people are put into the removal system is through jails and prisons. This is really becoming, one of the easiest ways for people to get detected because of the information sharing process and because of the Obama administration's emphasis on local police agencies being the sort of the heart of where we enforce immigration law now. And so this means that at the point of a traffic stop or when you get arrested or booked, and in some jurisdictions they're actually using roving fingerprint machines, or or cops are calling ICE at the point of checkpoints and just for traffic stops. You can get detected by immigration authorities, and a hold is put on you at the facility. So even if your arrest is illegal, you were completely racially profiled, and ultimately the district attorney's office decides not even to prosecute you or charge any offense, you're then put into the immigration removal system, processed and possibly detained for several years while you're trying to fight the case. So as you can probably tell, this is an extremely punitive system. There's no right to counsel. The people who are detained are often sent very far from their families. New Yorkers are often end up in Texas or Louisiana, or it used to be Arizona. The conditions of the detention are horrendous. There's sexual assaults. There's shackling of pregnant women. There are dogs that in the past have been used to help to sort of as disciplinary measures. There's segregation. It's like being in prison. I mean, it is being in prison basically. And then there's just very limited avenues for appellate relief. If you lose your case, the chances of winning on appeal are very low. And then there's such a variation in the law across the country that it's very hard for non-citizens to feel that they're getting a fair shake. Did you want to add anything?
There's so much.
There's so much to say. I know.
But I want to give a little bit more color on the situation that LGBT people in this circumstance face, because, as you would not be surprised to hear, a system that is horrible for everybody is additionally so for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, especially transgender and gender nonconforming people. Immigration equality hears from people who are detained all over the country, and often what we hear are stories of someone being put in 23-hour-a-day lockdown when they complain that they don't feel safe in the housing to which they've been assigned, because what is still happening, although there are some new regs released last week that are at least theoretically going to improve this a little bit, but that what is commonly happening is that transgender people are housed with their birth sex or housed according to a very, very high bar for sex reassignment surgery that lots of trans people can't meet. So, so a transgender woman could be housed in a men's facility, and in a men's facility that may not necessarily be other immigration detainees, because lots of these facilities are ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is contracting with state and local jails, We hear from people who are detained on immigration violations in custody, trans women detained in custody with men who are sex offenders. And then when they complain that they don't feel safe, they're placed in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. So the housing issues, obviously the privacy issues, we've been duking it out with the facility in Elizabeth, New Jersey, about why providing shower curtains, which the facility didn't have, would be one way to protect people and really cut down on some of the violent harassment that they're facing. They acknowledged that that was a good idea when one of our staff attorneys, Aaron, was at the facility recently. He asked, "Did you buy the shower curtains?" And they said yes. And he said, "Have you installed the shower curtains?" And they said no. And Aaron said, "Would you like me to install them?" And then they said that if he got any more belligerent, he might have to leave. That these are some of the kind of small bore issues that obviously have huge implications. In addition to which, access to hormone therapy for transgender people, access to HIV meds for people with HIV, not to mention privacy issues around medical treatment, are just exacerbated for vulnerable LGBT people. There is under this administration a little bit of a willingness to try to improve conditions, but the regulations that were released this week, which do have some good language about the treatment of LGBT people in the detention system in particular, are pretty toothless. So, we now have something good on paper, but it's the likelihood of getting it enforced is not great.
Yeah. And I think it's important just to highlight that those regs didn't come because the administration decided it was a good thing to do. It's years and years of advocacy by folks on legal service providers and other advocates. Years. And so at the end of the day, we're looking at, we need to deal with improving conditions of a system because it's growing so large, and we're getting a lot of bad attention for people dying in the facilities.
Right. But when we say to them, well, why are you detaining so many people in the first place? The answer is, well, that's what we're budgeted to do.
Okay. So we should go first.
Well, so when we talked a lot about the concept of vulnerability and how it could or maybe could not be useful in sort of some of helping practitioners think about the work we do and other routes to results. I think I'm going to sort of walk through a little bit of sort of the no, vulnerability isn't helpful, and then Sunita's going to try a sort of a take at, vulnerability could be useful, and then we are going to offer sort of one more overarching example. So I think that the problem that the current immigration system sets up for undocumented people, either people who have fallen out of status, particularly people who never had status in the first place when they got here, is that the law draws a bright line rule between people who are in and people who are out, and it's structured in a way that is creating a 21st century slavery, because the essence, the legal definition of slavery is inextricable from the legal definition of citizenship, and what we have now is a legal barrier to full participation that is so enormous that it's hard for me to see how, looking at it through a different lens or turning it around with some of the interesting tools that the vulnerability analysis presents, I don't see how they can get you around the core problem. And so sort of my very quickie explanation of why I literally mean slavery is sort of a kind of 3-point analysis. Undocumented immigrants in the United States today are workers who are uncompensated, undercompensated significantly, and sometimes not compensated at all, who do hard and dangerous work, but who are denied safety protections and health protections, either by the law or by intimidation or both. They are generally, 75% of undocumented people in the United States are from Mexico, Central and South America. So as a group, darker skinned than the ruling class, and their racial identity and their linguistic isolation from the ruling class makes them identifiably and for the course of their own lifetime permanently other. And essentially, for the third point, these are people who are not citizens, and under current law, until the law changes, they never will be. They will live, they will work, they will die in the United States without the possibility of full citizenship and civic participation. And those three things taken together, to me, add up to a situation that I can only describe as slavery. And the 14th Amendment is crucial to the end of slavery in the United States, right? Defining citizenship to mean all persons born or naturalized here was crucial, because how could you know you weren't a slave if you couldn't say that you knew that you were a citizen? And slavery is legally the opposite of citizenship. So an underclass of dark-skinned workers permanently locked out of ever being citizens is slavery, and it's slavery that is being championed by the United States Congress in the 21st century. And to me, with my handicap of being a lawyer, that's a legal problem, and I don't see how a vulnerability analysis gets you out of it.
Well, and I was just going to comment briefly that, you know, the immigration laws and historically have been set up on a system of othering certain groups, accepting certain groups, and not others. I mean, it's no secret the northern border is policed very differently than the southern border. In the southern border, we basically have a military outpost where they're testing all kinds of equipment and technologies. And the northern border is very porous. There's, you know, friends of mine who live.
Although less so than it used to be.
Less so than it used to be. That's very true. But you know, it's just the concept of it, right? And so in northern border towns, you know, I have friends that live along in Seattle who say there's lots of undocumented folks walking around. They're just white, and so nobody ever asks them what their status is. And so I think one of the things that's important here is that you can't de-race or take away the racial aspect of immigration law. You know, whether you're talking about Chinese Exclusion Act, or you're talking about Japanese internment, or you're talking about our modern day kind of quota system, or the way that law enforcement is getting involved in the immigration business. There's an inherent undergirding concept of racialization that's there. And then when you put on top of it the issues of gender and issues of sexual identity or non-conforming gender identity, you get a whole host of other problems that are, I think, are hard. It's hard to move away from an identity-based discussion, even though I think that the concept of vulnerability is very interesting in terms of how institutions, if you think about immigrants as they interact with institutions and how institutions can change the way that they treat people, I think there are some interesting interplays there. But I think if maybe for the interest of time, we wanted to take a couple comments about this. Like, what did you guys think? Does anyone have questions about the removal system or the immigration law? Does anybody want to, you know, make some comments about how they think the vulnerability analysis could or could not work with immigration policy? Well, it's a really interesting point, because I do think that there's a changing notion of what it means to be a citizen, right? So on the local level, there's a real question, like what makes you a local citizen? You know, the Go Local thing is about being a good citizen in your community. And there are some jurisdictions that actually allow undocumented people to vote in very small school board elections, because there's this ethos and this idea that who cares if you don't have status? You know, you're still a part of this community. So I think there are some ways in which the notion of citizenship is being, from the meta-narrative, is being contested on the local level. But I think that's a good point.
So in 1996, there were many very terrible things that were implanted in 1996 that made immigration law a lot harder on people. The list is very long.
Yeah.
One of them is that you must seek asylum in the United States within your first year of arrival here. And there are a couple of exceptions, but the exceptions are very difficult to win. And it's interesting, it's sort of based on a very kind of, I mean, I think it came when you, I've looked at the congressional record and the debate around that one-year filing deadline, and it came out of a very kind of classical political understanding of what political asylum was, right? Someone seeking political asylum, as it's often called, not quite accurately, is, you know, a member of the minority party, and they've fled repression from their government, and they're coming to America to be free, and that's why they're here. They know it's why they're here. The day they arrive, they can articulate it just that way. The idea that you might have a valid claim to relief because you legitimately fear persecution on account of a basis that the United States is willing to acknowledge. So if, for example, you are a lesbian from Zimbabwe who, you know, has done everything you could do to get yourself to the United States because you're terrified to stay in Zimbabwe, but you're not going to raise your hand to the man in the uniform at JFK Airport and say, oh, I'm gay, that's why I'm here. And how could you, especially against a backdrop of which, I mean, on the LGBT circumstance in particular, where there is continuing and obvious discrimination against LGBT people in the United States, including very specifically in the immigration system, if you are a recent arrival, especially if you don't speak English, and if you don't speak English or Spanish, how you would ever find out that, oh, you should definitely tell them you're gay. That's a real positive factor in your immigration case. That'll get you to a green card if you've really got a legitimate claim, is something that can take people a very long time to find out, and often by the time they have found that out, it's too late for them to make that case. So there are some efforts to repeal the one-year filing deadline that I think will eventually be successful.
Yeah. And so Rachel's going to talk a little bit about a recent policy initiative called the Prosecutorial Discretion, which is something the administration's been really pushing forward. But I just wanted to comment briefly on the difference with women, because this is not going to come up later. It would very quickly that I found as a practitioner representing women, and in particular women who have criminal convictions, women who are detained, which tend to be, I mean, they're just poorer women, they're just women who have less access to different services, that there is a way in which there's a bias against them in the removal system, because they have to be seen as either victims or mothers, you know, and this idea of the mother, you know, is a real interesting one, because you have to show you have equities in order to be able to convince a judge you should get a second chance, and the biggest equity you can have is U.S. citizen children, one of the biggest equities you can have. And so when you look at what happens to the father, there's this like sort of forgiveness that a father might not have as close of a relationship with their children, but then they are expected to pay their child support or provide some kind of financial assistance, whereas a mother is expected to, you know, have custody of their child and take care of them and be self-sacrificing and all of those things that kind of come with the notion of motherhood, and it doesn't always work like that, you know. So,
Prosecutorial discretion is it's not even a program, it's a concept that the Obama administration has put forward. You can sort of think of it as like, you know, they flooded the sink with people in removal proceedings, and now they're like, you know, that little hole at the top of your sink, like to try to take some of the water out, is sort of what prosecutorial discretion is trying to accomplish. It basically takes undocumented people, not only people in removal proceedings, but the undocumented population as a sort of theoretical construct, and says, you know what, we're going to group undocumented people into two groups: people with criminal convictions and people who have entered very recently or who are, quote, serial immigration violators, which means that they were removed, they came back in, they were moved, they came back in, sometimes they're coming back in to see their family. Those people, but people who have committed, they say serious crimes, although the definition of what a serious crime is has gotten very broad. So criminals are sort of on one side, persona non grata, kind of permanently on fast track to removal. People who are not criminals and can then show equities of a whole bunch of sorts are in this sort of other bucket and will be considered for prosecutorial discretion, which is what it sounds like, right? The discretion of whether or not to prosecute, both in the sort of at the stage where the prosecution is already taking place, so somebody's in removal proceedings, and the question is, could you close that case? Or even, although this is still very germinal, in the determinations about whether somebody will be placed into removal proceedings in the first place. And so the kinds of equities that the government has named in different ways, sometimes more explicitly, sometimes less explicitly, but include people who would be DREAM Act eligible if the DREAM Act passed, so people who came to the United States as minors and have gone to school in the U.S. It's a longer definition, but that's very, very overbroad. Family of military veterans, which is kind of an interesting, used to be sort of people who are themselves military veterans. There's a little bit of an expansion around people who are the relatives of military veterans, elderly people, victims of crimes, people who are seriously ill, physically or mentally ill, and individuals who have, quote, very long-term presence in the United States, an immediate family member who is a U.S. citizen, have established compelling ties to the U.S., and have made compelling contributions to the United States. So interesting, right? I mean, it's really different than the kinds of bright line rules we see elsewhere, and it's certainly sort of, at least as advertised, an attempt to take a kind of richer description of who you are and what your needs are into account in deciding to do you the limited favor, but still the favor of closing your case. So, you want to comment a little on sort of
yeah,
what that,
exactly.
what, sort of where that falls out?
I think that practically speaking, what it does though is some of these people might even be eligible for relief and could stay here with a green card and eventually become citizens. But what this does is it closes their case. They then don't have the benefit of that adjudication. I mean, they also take the risk then if people could lose. But there is a
I mean, it's kind of a plea bargain.
It's like a plea bargain. What I've seen happening, and I'm not sure if this is across the board for everyone, but they're also trying to monitor people. So you might have to come in and check in with ICE, with the Immigration Enforcement Agency, and and there's fingerprint checks. There's like all these other requirements that go into it, and sometimes people feel like they'd rather take their chances in court. It's kind of interesting, and I think sometimes the prosecutors are offering this when they know they're going to lose, and they don't want to have to worry about an appeal. I think that practically speaking, it is benefiting some people. It is benefiting a group of people, but I think there's a real outcry that it's clearly not enough, because the administration is saying this is our solution to the fact that there isn't comprehensive immigration reform. We're going to prioritize removal of some people over others, and this is one of the things that they've put out there. It's also really clear that prosecutorial discretion was always something that was a tool of the prosecutors before. Never worked then, and without a lot of training and a lot of oversight, I'm pessimistic as to what the actual impact's going to be.
So, for example, the administration has said in press conferences that the family members who will count as an equity are to include LGBT family members. That's not the same as recognizing the valid marriage you
Right.
may have to your U.S. citizen spouse, which they still are absolutely refusing to do, but that there would be a way that your family relationships would be recognized. However, they won't put it in writing. They've told Immigration Equality, when we've met with them on this topic, that ICE officers in the field are being trained on the issue of LGBT family relationships, but there is no written guidance. So, but I think it struck us when we were sort of looking at sort of where does vulnerability as a lens on immigration law as it plays out practically, kind of where does that work? And as Sunita said, pregnant and nursing women are sort of another category that gets a little point, a little check mark. I mean, this is all very opaque, right? Sort of who's adding up your equities, what's your opportunity to make your case? If you have an immigration lawyer on an existing case, does your lawyer get to appear before the people who are making this determination? Who is making this determination? I mean,
It's
all
not a
of
judge,
these things
you know,
are
it's not a
very,
judge.
very, very unclear. So,
But keep a lookout for that. There's going to be more coming out about that.
another hot question. Maybe the administration has said maybe. I mean, that there will be a way that people who are given prosecutorial discretion could apply for work authorization, but with no promises as to exactly who, exactly how, for how long. I mean, again, all of this is sort of, if you see this as short-term fixes against a backdrop of, oh, sometime soon we'll have comprehensive immigration reform, and it'll be thorough, and it'll be good, and there will be real answers for people that will address their real lives, then it looks like, all right, well, at least there are some short-term measures. If you see, but if you think that waiting for comprehensive immigration reform is waiting for Godot, then this is all kind of lame.
So we wanted to break it up into two groups, and then just have a little bit more of a discussion. Do you want to why don't you describe your group?
Sure.
And I'll describe mine, and we can
One
just
group is
break up.
one group's going to go with me and on one of these sides of the room, and just talk a little bit about LGBT asylum, how you meet the standard, and what that says about identity, and how you identify yourself, how other people identify you, whether vulnerability is a helpful addition to the sort of toolkit in looking at LGBT asylum claims.
Yeah, and then I'm going to take a group to talk a little bit about this issue of the Violence Against Women Act, and just the way that women, and men, but how within the immigration framework there is this victim kind of persona that gets out there, and we can talk a little bit about how that works when we're talking about crime victims who have to report and work with law enforcement and those kinds of